a case study in the correlation between the Failure is Not an Option, and specifically the Courageous Leadership Academy and student achievement. We're excited to have not one but three esteemed colleagues here today from all over the country. One in Washington D.C., one out in California, and special guest out in Texas, where the actual study occurred. So what we want to do before we get started, just so everyone knows, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the technology that we're going to use today. As you may be aware, you won't be able to verbally communicate with us, but we still encourage you to communicate with us nonetheless. On the right side of your screen, or perhaps the left, there should be a control panel. In that control panel, there is a chat window, and we have been communicating with you previously. Why don't we start by everyone kind of getting accustomed to that chat window by please just in that chat window tell us something that you want to get out of today's webinar. So in the chat window, we'll take a few moments so you can become accustomed to that. And why don't you tell us what you wish to get out of today's webinar. And I will pause for a moment and allow you to do that. Okay. And so then, in addition, now what we want here we have some initial comments which I will share. Actually, someone says they are anxious to meet Becky virtually. So, Becky, you have people who are anxious to meet you already. Carrie says that she's interested in ways that they can increase student achievement in their district. Sarah is saying she wants to know about successful programs and best practices of high school achievement. So here are some comments. So we're very happy that you're able to locate the chat window. So please have those come in so that we'll be able to move things forward. The second thing is I want you all to kind of start. We want to figure out kind of where people are in the spectrum. So what I would like to do is ask two poll questions. The first question, which I will launch now, is have you ever read the book Failure is Not an Option? Have you read the book Failure is Not an Option? And please take some time to enter the information in the screen there. Okay, we're starting to get some with 50, now 65% of the people voting. It's currently about 36% yes, and then about 65% no. So I will close the poll now and share that with everyone. So here are the poll results. About 35% of you all said yes, and then 65 said no. Okay, so those people who said no, I'm interested to know one additional question. So we want to know, for those people who don't know about or didn't read the book, how familiar are you with the 6 principles of failure is not an option? Very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar at all? Please use the window in front of you, the GoToMeeting window, and just put your answer right in there. Okay, there have lots of people coming in right now. So generally it's somewhat familiar or or not familiar, so we have about 61% of the people voting. I'll close this one out and share it with everyone so everyone can see. So with about 65% of the people voting, we had about 19% who were very familiar, and 42% who were somewhat familiar, and then finally 39% who were very familiar. So now what we want to do is we will move on through our presentation today. So if we can just close this out, then we will go back to the screen. Okay, so today we have three esteemed presenters. The first is Dr. Sarah Giangiaco. She is the area superintendent of Mansfield School District. We'll talk a little bit more about this we did in her school district. The second one is Dr. Analyst for the American Institutes of Research, and we'll actually start with Dr. Ann Richards. She joins us California. She was the former Director of Instructional Services for Thermalito Unified School District in Oroville, California, and she is now the Dean of Faculty for the Hope Foundation. You can now we can see the agenda for today. We will start, as I mentioned, with Dr. Richards talking about the Courageous Leadership Academy. Then we'll go to Dr. Becky Herman, who will talk about the overview of the study that we talked about. And then Dr. Sarah Giangiaco will talk to us about some of what happened there at the district. And then we'll end today's presentation with questions and answers. Now it's my distinct pleasure to hand over to the discussion today to Dr. Ann Richards, who I've known for quite a while and now have the pleasure of working with. So Dr. Richards, please let us know that you have everything ready to go.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. And I would like to join Eric in welcoming all of you to our webinar, and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us for about an hour. So I will be talking about the Courageous Leadership Academy, and I do need to talk to my technical staff to say my slides are not advancing. So maybe you could set me up for that, please. Oh, a little technical issue here. Luke or Eric?
Hi, Ann.
Yeah.
Have you tried clicking twice?
I did.
Okay, just let me advance the slides for you.
Okay, and you'll know when.
Just nod your head when you're ready to advance
got
the slides.
it. Thank you. So thank you. So this is good. So as Eric indicated, I'm actually going to be talking about the Courageous Leadership Academy, or the CLA. And I'm glad, Eric, that you mentioned my previous experience, because actually because of my work in this small rural district in California, I've had an opportunity to experience the CLA both on providing the services, actually through HOPE, but also my district participated in it. So I really have an opportunity from two different vantage points to know what the curriculum does. And as you can notice from the slide, the subtitle of this 10-minute or so presentation is Closing the Leadership Gap. I borrowed this expression from my colleague Mary Dietz, who's actually the designer of the curriculum. in a conversation we were having a few weeks ago about closing the achievement gap, when she said really where we need to focus is closing the achievement gap. And I thought that's an apt subtitle because I do think that the CLA does that in fact. So what I'd like to get us started with is, what do we even mean by leadership? The next slide has a definition that we actually use in our programs from Patterson and Patterson. As you can see there, it says a teacher leader is someone who works with colleagues for the purpose of improving teaching and learning. They earn their place as culture leaders. So they're not only actively engaged with their colleagues, they're helping shape culture. So the question I'll really be addressing is, how does this actually happen in the CLA? And I'd like to do that in three ways. I'll talk about the structure of the program briefly, but then really about the content, what's included, and I'll conclude with what are the benefits. So as you can see here, the structure is that we actually work with school leadership teams, and we meet with these teams 4 times throughout the year. Now, these teams are actually made up of teachers and their administrators, principals, assistant principals. So it's really an entire team of emerging leadership that is very much a part of the program. And even though we have just a select group of teachers that are actually working with this, the good news is all the teachers from the school benefit. And that's because, as you can see from the second bullet, each of our CLA session ends with, about an hour or so of time for these teams to actually apply what they've learned to develop what we call reentry plans. The purpose of these plans is right from the definition we just shared with you, to work with their colleagues for the purpose of basically improving student achievement through improving teaching and learning. There's lots of ways that you might do this. For example, there might be an article that we read in the program that they think, wow, definitely want to bring this to a faculty meeting. So they may bring a professional development activity, or maybe one of the things we've done in the program is teach a certain protocol to look at improving instruction, and they decide, yes, I'm going to bring this to my collaboration time with my colleagues. But the SLT, or leadership teams, aren't the only structure. One of the other aspects that we think is really important to assure that the program sustains even after we're no longer a part of it is that we work with both the site and district administrators who support, or what we also call sponsor, the program. Even before the CLA starts, we meet with this group and talk about what are their unique responsibilities to assure that the program is really going to keep going. And we also use these opportunities during the program to talk about how are we doing aligning our curriculum with your specific needs. So that's how the CLA is structured. Let's talk a little bit about what they actually learned. And the next slide has the framework that we use, the failure is not an option 6 principles. Now, I know that many of you from the poll we did haven't read the book or maybe aren't too familiar with them. So I'm going to do just a cursory way of talking about them, but hopefully will give you a sense about what they each are. None of these will be a surprise to you. They're familiar. They're all part of the school change and school improvement literature. But what we do with them, even though they're listed here discreetly, is actually work with them as a system. They're quite interdependent, and with that perspective have really a tremendous effect on changing school culture and advancing your priorities. So let me start with the first one, mission, vision, values, and goals. One of the first activities we actually do with the leadership teams is have them define what their purpose is, to come up with their agreement of purpose, and they set their priority goals. And as you might imagine, that agreement guides and shapes and directs a lot of what they do going forward, and we keep looking for the coherence between what they say their purpose is and the kinds of activities they bring back to their faculty. The second principle Ensuring Achievement for All Students, Systems for Prevention and Intervention. Actually, the word systems, I want to say, is not just systems for student learning, but adult learners as well, because we know both need to be in a learning environment. And as you might imagine, if we're saying ensuring achievement for all students, we're definitely focusing on instruction here as well. So let me give you an example of what we teach in the CLA, and I'll cite an example from my former district. And you'll notice from my example that it isn't just Principle 2, but 3, collaborative teaming, and also the 4th principle, using data, which is very much interrelated in this. Each of the CLAs starts with the leadership teams developing or refining instructional SMART goals. Now, I'm aware that a lot of states actually sort of deliver what the goals need to be, but even with that, unless the teams begin to work with them to make sure they're specific enough, make sure that there are other goals as checkpoints along the way, they won't be all that useful to the teams actually advancing the goals. So each of these CLA years starts with teams working with these SMART goals. And as you might imagine then, each of the times we meet, we engage in an activity called checkpoints, instructional SMART goals checkpoints, where the teams look at what they said they wanted to have accomplished and they monitor their progress. How they do this is by looking at multiple sources of data, not just the assessment data, but student observations, other ways for teachers to have a sense of how are we doing. And in that conversation, they begin to identify, how's our instruction working? Do we need to maybe tweak it a little bit, do a little bit of customization or different kind of planning to better meet these student needs? And in the course of this, they may discover that, in fact, they have some gaps in their professional development, well, some gaps in their instructional repertoire, which would lend themselves to saying, boy, I could really strengthen learning how to, fill in the particular teaching skill here. In fact, what we did in my district is we were fortunate that we had a Wednesday release time, so that each Wednesday there was some opportunity for this 3rd principle, collaborative teaming, either at the grade level, the department level, or the faculty level. Teachers met together. At the grade level or department level, teachers would actually bring results of common formative assessments that they had already developed. And they would look at how did our students do? And although it did take a while to get the conversation here, they began talking about not just what was being taught and when in order to strengthen the student achievement, but the more vulnerable conversation is, how are we teaching? How is my instruction working? And this is where we saw over time more and more openness to really learn from one another, because within any grade level or department, there are going to be some teachers who maybe are a little more, shall I say, better at nailing a particular content standard than someone else. And then the key, the gift, is to really allow colleagues to learn from one another. And they did that by actually observing each other, looking at samples of student work. It was actually quite powerful. Then actually even within the CLA itself, there's also an opportunity to build this 3rd principle in terms of providing opportunities for the schools or the teams to share with one another, to continue to build that professional learning community district-wide. So the 5th principle, parent-community communications, here we're talking about gaining active engagement from family and community. And what is often the case, we find, is that although we all recognize how important it is to have a strong partnership here, if your district is like many of the ones that I've worked with, and certainly was the case where I have worked, we just don't put that much time and effort into this as we might. One of the tools that we introduce is actually called an audit of parent-community communications, where the teams really assess how are we doing building these effective partnerships. One of the things we discovered in Thermalito is, although we had a few really successful opportunities for parents to come to school to forge these partnerships, they were actually quite, shall I say, formal informal and intermittent. And from doing this process, we realized we needed to make the schools a friendlier place for our parents, many of whom, they weren't all that comfortable in schools themselves. I'm sure you know that kind of parent group. So each of the schools started a morning breakfast program, informal, drop-in with the principals. Here's the name. We called it Donuts with Dads or Muffins with Moms. And as you might imagine, they may have come for the breakfast treats, but they definitely stayed for the conversation and building the partnership. So the last principle here that I want to reference is about building sustainable leadership capacity. And I think the point I want to make here is that when you walk into a CLA that's maybe in its second or third year, you actually cannot tell the principal from the teacher leaders. Everybody's leaning forward, engaged in the conversation, talking about teaching and learning. It's really quite powerful. So the leadership capacity is sustained through many of these different activities, but it's also how the curriculum is designed. And on the next slide, you'll notice that our design is based on 5 knowledge development strands, as you can see here. I also want to mention many of you may be familiar with the extensive research on how individuals respond to change and innovation, the Concerns-Based Adoption Model, or CBAM. I actually did want to mention that explicitly because the curriculum is actually based knowing how to introduce various changes and innovations and address the participants' level of readiness. It's really one of the powerful ways that the whole curriculum comes together. And each of these strands is reintroduced, if you can imagine, a spiral each year with a little bit more depth and complexity. Let me just talk briefly about them. The first one I think we already did in terms of how the F&O principles are used as a system. In fact, I want to just mention I was on the phone recently with the district talking about our CLA services, and the assistant superintendent mentioned that, well, they have a lot of school initiatives in his district, but it's a hodgepodge, to use his language. I know I've been in that place. Perhaps some of you have as well. And one of the design features is to create a coherent and focused way to use the initiatives you already have in your district. Second one I want to address is team development. We work very explicitly with helping the teams really become high-performing professional learning communities, or PLCs. We also, in terms of the teacher as leader, work again explicitly with teaching them how to lead change through reading certain materials, through talking about this CBAM, as I've already referenced. Actually also giving them tips if they're going to be doing professional development with their colleagues, which they do, how to do that. And then also how to actually help facilitate their collaborations so that they might even have what you might call some of those courageous conversations that really get at making a difference in student learning. So the fourth strand to mention is instructional improvements. And I don't think we could have a program that gets at student increasing or accelerating student learning without talking about instructional improvement. And here I've already mentioned that we do actually teach some very specific processes and protocols that, again, the leadership teams bring back to their schools because that's where the change has to happen. All of it is in a standards-based professional development setting, very job embedded. And I want to mention I was talking to an assistant superintendent at a large district recently who's in the second and third year of the CLA, and she mentioned that they don't have a professional development department anymore at the central office because, in fact, it's all gone to the school site and even within the classroom. Because, as I've mentioned already, the teachers take ownership of what is it they need to be learning, and then how do they account for and plan for meeting those needs. So throughout the CLA, the teams also have a lot of opportunities to assess how they're doing at actually building their leadership capacity, because that is the primary goal. So the next slide mentions some of the assessments we use, and I'm not going to take the time with them now, but you'll notice the last one there, the FNO, failure is not an option readiness survey, is the one actually Becky will be addressing shortly. But just wanted to mainly mention that as part of building that leadership capacity, we give teams lots of opportunities to see how they're doing. So talked about the structure, talked about what's included. I'd like to end with why participate, what are the benefits. And what I'd like to do is actually ask you for just a minute is to think about your own school improvement priorities. What are they? And then as I just briefly summarize what the outcomes are from the CLA, you can ask yourself, would they contribute to advancing your goals? And just going back to the title of this, Closing the Leadership Gap, how do you think these outcomes would line up with that? So as you can see here, the first one we've certainly talked about in terms of using the 6 principles as a framework to embed and institutionalize a system for ongoing improvement in your schools and districts. Shared leadership and shared accountability. Together, we're much smarter than any one of us. And I hope and wonder for those of you listening who are principals, if you might begin to also see like, wow, I don't have to do this alone. I think we've all been in this place. I know I have when I was a school principal too, that I might be saying something to teachers and, well, it's the principal or whatever. A colleague of theirs, someone on the leadership team, would say the very same thing, and what a difference that makes to advancing what your priority goals are. So big benefit to having the shared leadership. We're building a collaborative culture, but not just any old collaborative culture, one that definitely focuses on teaching and learning and therefore student achievement. And then lastly, benefit is to sustain and continually improve instructional improvements, because really we talked about the team being culture shapers. Part of the culture that we're building here is one of continuous learning and improvement. So I've had a chance to tell you a little bit about this program, the Courageous Leadership Academy, the CLA. Becky is actually now going to talk about the relationship between implementing the program and achievement. Thank you.
Hello, this is Becky. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you about the Courageous Leadership Academy and the study that we conducted for the Hope Foundation of this initiative. And thank you, Anne, for providing such a great, thorough introduction to the intervention, which I think lays the groundwork for our talking about the study. And I'm also looking forward to hearing from Dr. Jandruko about her experiences, because I think altogether that gives you a picture that you would not get just from sort of the dry recital of what you get out of a study. But I do want to share with you what we found from our study of the Courageous Leadership Academy. We conducted a study looking at the levels of implementation and the relationship of implementation to achievement of the Courageous Leadership Academy in one district in Texas. This is a preliminary study analyzing existing data early in the intervention to identify indicators of potential. So it is early in the process and it is in one district, but I think that combined with what we know about the research that was the foundations of this intervention shows a fair amount of promise. That's my little preview. So this study looked at 3 evaluation questions. To what extent has school staff built a professional learning community? And in that, we looked at whether school staff are learning and internalizing those 6 principles, the 6 FNO principles that Anne just laid out for you. We also looked at whether they were achieving common purposes, goals, and values, and building a culture of trust, mutual accountability, and continuous improvement. So that's all part of, were the school staff building a professional learning community? And that's really a look at implementation. Was what the intervention being implemented as planned? Our second question is, does higher level of implementation correspond to higher achievement? And then finally, we looked at, had student achievement improved? So for this study, we focused on one district, Mansfield, an independent school district in Texas, and we looked at 34 schools in that district. Mansfield, almost the entire district implemented the Courageous Leadership Academy. They did it in 2 phases, in 2 cohorts. The first cohort, Cohort 1, began in 2007, 2008, and included intermediate, middle, and high schools, 14 schools. And the second cohort was 20 elementary schools that began implementing a year later. And in the analysis, I'll talk about how there was some differences between the first and the second cohort, and what one might hypothesize about what contributed to those differences. Generally, the cohorts all started together. There were a few schools which opened, the actual schools opened their doors after the Courageous Leadership Academy began, but they are included in with the rest of their districts. So we used 2 sources of data to look at the Courageous Leadership Academy. To look at outcomes, to look at achievement, we used the Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills text. And we used math scores and reading scores, and we reported those separately. And they generally moved together, but there were some differences. That test was administered in Texas, grades 3 through 12, and we had access to data from 2004 through 2010, through the last school year. We were able to look at what was happening in elementary school, which is grades 3 and 4, in intermediate school, grades 5 and 6, and in high school, grades 9 through 12, also middle school, grades 7 through 8. And the data that we used for the test scores was percent proficient for the school. Our second main source of data was to look at implementation of the Courageous Leadership Academy. We used the Failure is Not an Option Readiness Survey, and we used a survey that was administered in the spring of 2010. And Ann mentioned that survey. I'm just going to tell you a little teeny bit more about it because it helps you interpret what the findings are. The survey focuses on the 6 Failure is Not an Option principles, and there are 4 questions for each of those principles, so a total of 24 questions. For each of those principles, half of the questions are about understanding and use of that principle. And those are labeled knowledge or skills development. And the other half of the questions are about readiness to implement, which is commitment and action. And then there were scales that were developed that aggregated across those 6 principles, the knowledge and skills development is one scale, and there's a second scale about commitment and action questions. So those are the outcome measures that the measures we use to look at implementation. And the Hope Foundation is now administering that survey and a pre-test, post-test format. So it was in this district administered in the fall of 2009 and the spring of 2010 in a pre-test, post-test format. But because in this particular case we were limited to the data that were already there and we didn't have the pretest that really happened before the intervention ever began, we only had the beginning and the end of that school year. So we chose to focus on the end of the school year, the survey that was administered in spring 2010. So what did we find when we looked at these data? Here's a very quick summary. First, we found, looking at implementation, we found that by spring 2010, remember I told you that we looked at the survey that was given at the end of this period. By spring 2010, most of the CLA schools in Mansfield indicated very high levels of knowledge and skills as well as commitment and action for the core principles. None of the schools scored below the 3rd or 4th of the 4 levels on either of those 2 dimensions, on either of those 2 scales. So they were all in the top half. And in fact, 2/3 of the schools in Cohort 1 were at the very top level for knowledge and skills. And also for Cohort 1, more than 2/3 were at the top level for commitment and action, the second of those two scales. Cohort 2 did even better. 90 to 95%, depending on the scale, of those schools were at the top level for that scale. So they were clearly at high levels of implementation according to the readiness survey. We don't know why Cohort 2 seemed to do better on the survey than Cohort 1. There are a lot of ideas that we have about what might have been going on. It might have been that it's easier to implement this in elementary school, or it might be that in the year between when Cohort 1 started and Cohort 2 started, that there were improvements to the intervention that made it a stronger intervention by the time Cohort 2 started implementing. So we don't exactly know, and that's one of those things that we'd like to investigate a little bit further with more analysis. So that was a very quick look at implementation.
Mary has a question. She wanted to know why there were 2 cohorts in the study.
Well, we were, as I said, limited to the data that were available and to the way we didn't start the study before the intervention. We looked at this. We looked at the data after the intervention had started. So there were 2 cohorts because there were 2 groups of schools that started at different times. Cohort 2 started a year later than Cohort 1. And so at the time of the study, Cohort 1 had finished 3 years of the Courageous Leadership Academy. So they passed through all 3 of the major phases. And Cohort 2 had only gone through 2 of the 3 years. And so they'd only been there. They were still, in a way, mid-implementation. So it didn't make sense to analyze the 2 of them together because they were at different stages in the process. And I think that it would probably be a good question for Dr. Jandruco about why they implemented in phases, and it may have had to do with the resources that were available at the time, or kind of phasing in the support for the different schools. Does that address your question, Mary? Okay, you're silent, so I'm hoping that addresses it. Okay, so I'm going to move on, but feel free to jump in with questions. We also looked at the relationship between implementation and achievement. State test as our measure of achievement. And we found that the relationship between implementation and achievement was generally strong, although Cohort 2 had which had higher levels of implementation than Cohort 1, as I just mentioned, also seemed to have stronger implementation according to specific questions that were on the FNO readiness survey. And we found that the correlation between implementation and math achievement ranged from about 0.25 to 0.60. During the same years, the correlation between implementation and reading achievement ranged from negative 0.46 to 0.57. What we did when we were thinking about interpreting these findings is we looked at these findings against the context of the research base, the evidence that went into the development of the Courageous Leadership Academy, and there's generally strong evidence that says these things should work, and finding a correlation between implementation and achievement is a positive finding, is supportive of that. So that is a very quick look at what we found in the study. We're eager to be able to take a look a little bit later in the process and with more schools and more districts to see how broadly these findings apply. And of course, if you don't have a chance to ask questions of me, I cannot apparently advance my slide. If you don't have a chance to ask questions now, then I'm more than happy to talk about the details of the study or the findings. Feel free to contact me directly. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. And I think on to Dr. Jandruco. Are you?
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Becky. So now, without further ado, we want to actually talk about what happened there all at the district level. So we have with us from the Mansfield Independent School District, Dr. Sarah Giangiuco.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be with you and to talk to you. I want to thank Dr. Ann Richards for leading the presentation. Dr. Richards actually shared some of the things that I'm going to reinforce, what we saw in the district. And then, of course, we're flattered to be part of any research study. The findings were very interesting. I want to address Cohort 1 and Cohort 2 and then get back to my presentation in just a minute. But Cohort 1 were our secondary schools. They did start a year ahead of time. That was kind of a financial decision. For those of you in Texas know that we received some high school initiative funding, and we used that funding to bring in the Courageous Leadership Academy. Cohort 2 was not able to start that year. We actually had to do some additional requests for budgeting. We started the following year with the elementary schools, but during the year that Cohort 1 was in the Courageous Leadership Academy, I led the elementary schools in a book study. So we took the entire book, the 6 principles, and studied those over the course of the year. That was supported by some video presentations from the Hope Foundation. But let me get started. This afternoon, I want to share with you my passion and the benefits that have come from our relationship with the Hope Foundation through their Courageous Leadership Academy. We have been a rapidly growing district. When I saw 34 schools, I thought, well, that's not correct. It's now 39. But then when I realized when we had started with the Hope, we were probably at 34 schools. Over the last 10 to 12 years, we have put an average of 2 schools on the ground every year. In 1 year, we put 6 schools on the ground, including a comprehensive high school. This was the first year in 12 years that we have not opened a new campus. So we were adding anywhere from 1,700 to 2,000 students a year. We really had a need to help get everybody headed in the same direction and to refocus on student achievement. When you're in such a rapid growth mode, you have difficulty remaining focused on student achievement. And if you'll go to my first slide, I'd like to walk you through what we did in this district. So thank you. I think one of the biggest benefits, and if you can afford this, I know you might not be able to in your district, is to attend an event. And the Hope Foundation calls it an event rather than a conference, a seminar, or a workshop. And I thought that was a really great term. We were fortunate enough to send probably 25 or 30 administrators and central office staff to this event. It happened to be in Austin, Texas, which is about 3 hours from Mansfield. The event is very energizing. And what they do there, not only do you hear some great speakers, get to meet and interact with Alan, they also model what they hope will happen back in the district if you take on the challenge of a Courageous Leadership Academy. We came back after that event, and as Ann alluded to the fact, we formed a steering committee. This committee was a mixture of elementary, secondary principals, coordinators, and central office staff. At the time that we began our first Courageous Leadership Academy, the Hope Foundation didn't offer a one-day administrative seminar. When we began Cohort 2, they did. And that was very powerful, bringing in the principals from the various campuses to discuss how you might pull together a team, who should be on the team, and just an overview of what was going to happen at the Courageous Leadership Academy. We did the team formation, and I'm not sure exactly, I don't remember why we selected this number. Maybe it's how many people we could get around the table. But our elementary cohort teams had 8 members, generally 2 administrators, if a campus had 2 administrators, a counselor, and then 5 or 6 teachers. And those teachers generally span the content areas or the grade levels. Our secondary campuses had 10 members, again, 2 administrators, possibly a counselor, and then 7 team members. And what happens after the teams are formed, as Ann pointed out, you don't know who the principal is because the teachers have stepped up and you have no idea unless you know who's the leader of that campus. I want to give just a brief story of what happened in cohort 2 to speak to sustainable leadership. Male elementary principal, all the rest of the team were females. This often happens in an elementary building. Because they were all looking to him to be the leader, to direct, to give them the answers, he actually pulled his chair away from the team, crossed his arms in front of his chest, and just smiled and got very silent. Well, the teachers recognized, okay, if we're going to go anywhere or do anything, it's going to be up to us. And with that, just that little gesture, he sent a real powerful message to that team that we're all in this together and your voice is as important as my voice. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. You see our secondary had 10 members. I've spoken about the sustainable leadership and the importance of the principal being just a team member, just one of the teams, and it's a picture of one of our administrators with 2 teachers. Next slide, please. Now, what's really critical, and I can't emphasize this enough, that you facilitate an area where you're going to have strong face-to-face interaction. We actually, when we started, we couldn't get everybody in both cohorts in the same room. But we were fortunate to have all of cohort 1 in one room. And we had them around round tables. So each team had their own table. And when you were solving problems and discussing and reporting out, there's a lot of energy. There was a lot of noise in that room, but there was a lot of power. So I think it's critical. If you're a very large district and you're involving everyone, you might not be able to get everyone in the same room. If you're smaller, my suggestion would be put as many people in the same room at round tables as is possible. We actually had to go to 2 rooms when we added the second cohort, but the 2 large rooms were in close proximity to one another, so we could actually walk between the buildings and share. Next slide, if you can. Great. We started, and one of the most powerful things that I think occurred that Ann alluded to was we established core values. We actually, each team decided what it was they believed in. And they wrote those things down. And then they developed a reentry plan. How do we share that with the entire faculty? And how do we get the entire faculty to contribute to the core values? So that was an important piece. And they went out and they did that. And the campuses generally have somewhere on large butcher paper, it's not very formal, but it's very powerful, they have their core values. And another brief story of how those core values was used. In one of our elementary schools, the principal was walking the building, and I don't know if she heard a conversation in the classroom or if the teacher was out in the hall with her students, but the teacher was, as on occasion, really berating the students and belittling the students, and the principal was upset by her demeanor and what was going on. And she and I had a conversation, and she said, I want to address it with the teacher, but I'm not sure how. This is a good teacher. I don't want her to become defensive. This is not something I'm going to write up, but I do want to address it. And it occurred to her she could address it through the core values. And the teacher came in and they had a wonderful discussion because the principal was able to say, you were part of this, and here's what we believe in. We believe in the dignity of the student. We believe that the children should be in a safe and warm environment at this elementary school, but what was occurring didn't support those values. And I really think the teacher had an aha moment, and this wasn't something that was going to be written up or reflected on her teacher evaluation, but it was something that the principal wanted to address. So establishing those core values is critical. Every time we came together in the Courageous Leadership Academy, we looked at data. And the principals brought their own data. We get a plethora of data in Texas. We get all kinds of information. And so each team examined their data. And then they were challenged to solve what I call real problems. If your data says this, then look at this. What is it you want to do? And we asked them to move from a blame model to an improvement model. How do we solve these problems? What are some things you can do to prevent? What are some things you can do to intervene? Next slide. The most powerful thing, and Ann said, you begin to learn from one another. Oh my goodness. We learned and learned and learned. We shared and shared and shared. And what happened, I giggle a little bit, people made sure they brought a clipboard and made sure they had someone that was writing as fast as they could, because the good ideas were shared consistently and constantly. We shared sometimes with the table the school next to us, and it might have been someone in close proximity to us in Mansfield. We're 92 square miles. It might have been someone across town, and so maybe it was a campus that looks very different than us demographically, but we shared. We did some sharing out large groups, so you were expected to share some of your ideas about best practices to the entire group. We did what we call gallery walks, where you actually drew where you'd been, where you were going, and how you solved problems, and everybody got to take about 3 minutes and walk the room looking at this, and we'd leave people at the poster, the butcher paper, to report out. What this sharing does is gives you a sense of oneness. It helps dignify and support all the hard work that's going on out there, and I really thought it did a lot for relationships and building trust. When somebody says, oh my goodness, that's a great idea, I'm going to try that, or somebody says, you know, we do something similar, but you've tweaked it, and I like what you've done. Very, very powerful. One of the things that came out of it, every time you have to share a reentry plan. So the Hope Foundation and the Courageous Leadership Academy doesn't let you off the hook at the end of the day. You kind of have homework. How are you going to take this back to your campus? How are you going to include all the teachers? You can't really see this, but if you look closely at the graphic that has the hand on it, this actually came from a high school mathematics teacher at Mansfield High School, developed this idea, but he did it with his fist. Then we had an elementary teacher who saw this and said, let me try to visualize it. You can't see it on the screen as well, but let me walk you through it. The thumb is your mission, your vision, your values, your goals. It's the campus thumbprint. Your data, your next finger, you're going to be flipping through pages and pages of data. Your middle finger is generally your longest finger. It's your high achievement. We want the students to achieve at a high level. Your next finger, of course, is your ring finger. It's your engagement finger. And this talks about engaging the community in all aspects of this process. And then your little finger, everyone can be a leader, even me. And then when you pull all your fingers together, you pull it together in kind of a fist, a hopeful fist. a fist of collaboration that we're all working together. My last slide, please. What I want you to know is, of course, I'm passionate about our relationship with the Hope Foundation and our attendance at the CLA Academy. For 2 years with Cohort 2 and 3 years with Cohort 1. It's kind of a financial decision that we had to make. But I can tell you unequivocally what we've gained from our relationship. The CLA Academy provided us focused direction and gave us a real sense of commitment. We have a common vocabulary across 39 schools. We're all speaking the same language. We all know and understand the 6 principles. What it's done to increase leadership capacity within the school district has been phenomenal. Example, yesterday we had an elementary principals meeting. A teacher joined us and shared, and she said, "My principal has made me a leader even though I didn't think I could be a leader." That's happened. People have come up to me and said, "We've had deepened conversations about best practices. How do we help students?" And there's just a sense of trust that we're all in this together. And even though right now Rebecca wasn't able to share with you significant increases in our student achievement, I know in time we will have improved student achievement. I think I have one more slide that I'd like to end with. Just a cute slide. We've involved, and we say that often. So thank you all very much, and I think we have some time for some questions and answers. I've enjoyed being with you.
Thank you all very, very much for joining us and for being a part of the panel today. We do have questions in the beginning, but please, if you have some questions, please post them and we will try to get to them as time permits. We will start with a question that's similar, both from Dr. Derek Wallace and from Ella. And they asked, kind of what were the culminating set of events that brought you to bring the Courageous Leadership Academy to your district? Were you solicited by the Hope Foundation, or did you reach out? So that's kind of a question, and that question is to you, Dr. Janjuko.
Yeah, I can answer that. Hope didn't really reach out to us. We actually found them, and I think that we may have seen our assistant superintendent of secondary, not positive, may have seen a brief presentation either at our midwinter conference or another conference. So he did a little more digging, and we were really able to attend the event put on by the Hope Foundation in Austin, and that really was the spark. That was 3 days of quite energizing activities. So we reached out to them and began to have a formal relationship, which we've had a 3-year formal relationship with them. This year it's been much more informal, but because all the principals are so institutionalized, we pulled the teams together off the campus, not 4 times this year, but 2 times. So we reached out to the Hope Foundation, and it's benefited us. Thank you.
And an additional question, and we're still talking about cohorts, and I guess any of the panelists can jump in here. Were the demographics of the cohorts, were they similar?
Yes, Mansfield ISD is a very diverse group. Now, some of the teams, the schools that the teams represent may look slightly different, but the cohorts, remember, our elementary students feed into our secondary schools, so the cohorts in general mirror one another. We had, at the time the study began, I think she said 20 elementaries. We're going to have 22 next year, but of course those students feed right into our secondary, so our cohorts are similar.
additional question. So let me answer a common question that occurs, and then if anyone else has any questions for any of the panelists, Dr. Richards, Dr. Herman, or Dr. Jandruko, then please put those in your chat window. But a common question that's asked, are the slides available? If you visit the Hope Foundation website, and we've been posting that link in the chat window, if you visit that link, you will be able to find information on past webinars, future webinars, and events. And there you can find an archive of the videos. So, you know, in at least a week or so, we'll have the video up, and you will be able to access it there. Any additional questions that we might have? Here's another question with the common language. Again, this one's for you, Dr. Jandruko. The common language, deeper conversation, and improved student achievement. Has there been more of an ability to improve your response to intervention strategies?
Oh, absolutely, because I think in the sharing, since the focus is on intervention, a lot of the discussion was how do you intervene with students? And they solved some of those problems in the course of 3 years. They were able to implement things like an intervention lab, stronger student support teams, and those discussions went deeper, and they shared out. They shared out a lot of ideas. You know, the Hope Foundation certainly is not a program. It's not a process. It's a way of helping a district build a culture. And so I think our culture focuses on what can we do to prevent failure. If this doesn't work, what do we do next? If this doesn't work, what do we do next? And I think for the most part, the teachers have come along with that sort of shift in thinking. The principals certainly have. And so all our dialogue is, if this didn't work, what are you going to try now? And people shared and shared and shared.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question. And the question is, did the school leadership teams seem to have desired cooperation from the campus groups? Were they receptive of, were the campus groups receptive of the school leadership teams when they reported back to the campus?
That's a great question. I was asked earlier in another conversation if we got a lot of pushback. I wouldn't say we got pushback. Clearly, there were some schools and teams that were more engaged. And if you have a high level of energy and engagement with your core team, then that's what went back to the campuses. There were some campuses, and still probably are some campuses, that are not engaged at the level I'd like them to be engaged at. So if that occurs, then you don't get quite the sense of energy or buy-in at the campus. But I'm out at the campuses and able to do a lot, and that vocabulary is out there. I think you would see different energy levels, different commitments, and that showed up a little bit in the study, but you'll see a different level, a sense of commitment at our campuses. I'm not you. Everybody's at 100%, but we really didn't get pushback. I think it was more in terms of engagement.
Okay. Well, I think we want to be cognizant of time. Thank you all. Thank everyone for your time here today. We appreciate your questions. If your question didn't get asked, please, feel free to leave the question. We will have follow-up. So if you have a question, you can post it there. Someone can follow up with you. Or after you close out the webinar, there will be an opportunity for you to submit a survey in which you can ask your questions there. We encourage you to do so. Again, on behalf of the Hope Foundation, I would like to thank Dr. Sarah Jandruko, Dr. Becky Herman, and Dr. Ann Richards for their time today, as well as yours. Thank you very much, and please help join us next week. We have another webinar about the transformation model, so please join us at that time as well. Thank you very much for your time. Have a fantastic day.
Is someone still on the line?